So, welcome everybody to the final presentation in our seminar series, What Were We Thinking? We are very happy to introduce Ian Buchanan to you, who hails from the University of Wollongong, Australia. As most of you probably know, Ian is a well-known Deleuze and Guattari expert. He's the founding editor of the journal, Deleuze and Guattari Studies, and has fostered, I think, thousands probably of books and articles on Deleuze and Guattari into being, and has written hundreds himself, one of the latest being Assemblage Theory and Method. I think as you all probably know, a massive part of Deleuze and Guattari's work circled around thinking about what thinking is and what thinking should be. And they were strongly critical of what Deleuze called the dogmatic image of thought. I mean, this is the stereotypical picture of what we understand when we try to say what thinking is. So if you Google what is thinking, then you get the exact picture of the dogmatic image of thought, even today. But Deleuze and Guattari were not only critical of the dogmatic image of thought, they also spent a lot of time working on practical alternatives. And this is what assemblage theory is all about. So I'm very excited to have an international expert to open this up for us. So welcome in. Great to see you, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Andrea. I don't think I could possibly live up to that introduction, but I will nevertheless try. So after I wrote the book on assemblage theory, I was interested in what I'd left out of that book and realized that one of the things that I had left out was the idea of affect. So this presentation is excerpted from what feels like a never-to-be-completed book that I'm apparently not writing on the connection between assemblage theory and affect theory. So it kind of goes to a slightly different question of not so much what is thinking, but what is necessary for thinking to have the tonality, if you like, that it does. So the overall argument of this apparently imaginary book is that assemblage theory and affect theory are kind of like twins that were but should not have been separated at birth. And so the writing of this book has been unnecessarily protracted, I must say. But it has also had several moments that are rather like those scenes from the Comedy of Errors, when the two sets of twins meet each other in Syracuse, and suddenly there's the recognition that these concepts really should have been together all along. So I want to advance my argument, if you like, that the assemblage and affect should go together by way of three theorems that are drawn from Deleuze and Guattari's work. Now, what I'm going to propose is very much a radical departure from the way by which affect has been thought about with respect to Deleuze and Guattari's work. So I imagine for those of you that are familiar with it, it will be kind of a provocation, which is, of course, the point. Now, there is no straightforward way to answer the question, what is affect, with regards to Deleuze and Guattari's work. And in fact, it sometimes seems like there are several answers to the question, because there seems to be several versions of affect within their work, which are not necessarily in agreement with one another. And this, of course, is an untenable theoretical position. So it's also one of the reasons why this book has taken far longer to write than I ever anticipated. So what I want to try to do is present a case for what we might call a unified field theory approach, to borrow a concept from physics. Now, while this nod to physics is deliberate, and it will make sense in a moment why I want to do that, it should not be taken literally. It functions only as an inspiration for the approach which I want to take, which seeks to build a coherent model from an apparently disparate and at times divergent set of ideas and applications in Deleuze and Guattari's work. And here I'm following Guattari's lead. He was both very clear about what it means to take inspiration from science in his work, which he and Deleuze frequently do, and of the value in doing so. And in a beautiful passage in the posthumously published collection Lines of Flight, he says, rather than clinging to simplistic modes of causality, we should take inspiration from more recent models, by which he meant quantum physics, and then adds a sort of crucial caveat. Inspiration, he says, has to be understood here in the poetic sense, or that of walkers who need a change of scenery. It is not, he says, a matter of proposing new tracings or the compulsive search for a scientificity in these domains, something that seems to arise more from obsessional neurosis than from theoretical analysis connected with social realities. The turn to science, particularly, so that's end of quote, me talking now, this turn to science, particularly cognitive science, has, I think, also occasioned, albeit unintentionally, a turn away from philosophy in general and Deleuze and Guattari's work in particular. And this is quite evident in Brian Massumi's work, which, however you want to regard that, is very much a turn towards the cognitive science as a way of answering problems that are posed philosophically but not answered philosophically. So I want to try to set that right by using science as a change of scenery rather than a point of reference, and propose an answer to the question, what is affect, that takes into account the full spectrum, i.e. the unified field of Deleuze and Guattari's work. And I propose to define affect by 3 interlocking theorems, as I mentioned. First, at what may be regarded the molar level, affect is a capacitating power. Second, at what might be regarded as a molecular level, affect is desire in its quantum form. And third, also at a molecular level, affect has a combinatory power. The first part of the definition relates to the way that affect functions in everyday life, by which I mean the way we experience it and talk about it. The second part of the definition relates to its composition, which may be visualized as a substance composed of highly charged particles of feeling, or what we might more precisely call relating, inasmuch that in combination they determine the nature of our relationship to the world. The third part of the definition has to do with the possibilities and impossibilities of combining the charged particles of affect, so the quantum dimension, under determinate conditions. And here one can think of the literally hundreds of books about the ontology of love and all that it does or does not entail. So, for example, where is the line to be drawn between romantic love and platonic friendship, or sexual attraction and love, or love and various forms of care? My contention is that Deleuze and Guattari's theory of schizoanalysis hinges on the premise that the capacitating power of desire is determined by the combination of charged particles of affect at the quantum level. Now, this hypothesis points towards an active model of affect rather than a receptive model. What do I mean by this? At its most basic, affect is what enables us to get out of bed in the morning, to go for a run, to write a book, to fall in love, and so on. It is what enables us to interact with the world, to feel good about ourselves and others, to want to pat dogs, to listen to music, or to dance. It finds expression in moods, feelings, emotions, and so on, but always operates on a different level. So, for example, a good mood is an expression of an upbeat affect. Our mood may be spoilt by a tasteless remark, or the weather becoming inclement and ruining a pleasant walk in the park. But this change in our mood does not necessarily stem from or register at the level of affect, inasmuch that our good mood may return if someone compliments us, or the sunshine chases away the rain. Affect in this sense is our capacity to be in a good mood. Someone who is seemingly incapable of being in a good mood is usually described as lacking in affect, or perhaps as suffering from some so-called flattened affect. If they appear to lack the capacity to remain in a good mood, or else bounce back after being in a bad mood, then their affect is said to lack tolerance. People classified or identifying as neurodivergent are said to have a different affect, which capacitates them in ways neurotypical people may find difficult to appreciate or comprehend. Now, this way of thinking is no doubt familiar to anyone who has read even a smattering of pop psychology, but that doesn't mean that it is either irrelevant, wrong, or completely at odds with anything that Deleuze and Guattari say. In fact, it is surprisingly consistent with the ways by which they deploy Spinoza, and unsurprisingly, I guess, there is quite a lot of work within cognitive science. One thinks of Damasio, for instance, connecting cognitive science with Spinoza. And in this sense, it can and should be grasped as a contribution to our everyday understanding of psychology, by which I mean the way we think about behavior in an everyday setting. If our receptivity towards the world is not given, then we must ask, how do we become receptive to the world? Now, I'm not yet in a position to answer this question, but I can perhaps give an indication of the scope of the question by returning to the apparently trivial example of being in a good mood. If we were to ask, why does our capacity to be happy and to respond positively to this thing, let's say sunshine, and negatively to this other thing, rain, then we would be forced to suppose at least two things. First, that the composition of affect differed between people, or otherwise we would all respond in the same way to the same stimuli, which clearly we do not. Second, the affect functions selectively. It does not respond equally appreciatively to all stimuli, but neither does it respond in the same way every time. On a cold day, rain is usually experienced as miserable and annoying, but on a hot day, it might come as a cool relief. How we feel in these situations depends on our affect as the capacity to feel and relate. The fact that we experience the same stimuli differently, both as individuals and collectively, i.e. some of us like sunshine some of the time, but perhaps not all of the time, and not necessarily at the same time as others, means that we cannot treat affect as a machine that has only one setting. We need to account for its variability. But that is easier said than done. If the same stimuli produce different responses in different people, or even in the same person at different times, then the variability of affect cannot be explained solely in terms of stimulus and response. It is not different sunshine, but differently perceived sunshine that explains the differences in people's responses to the feeling of sun on their face. And this also rules out the idea that affect is exclusively, much less ultimately, bodily, which is very much how affect is talked about within cultural studies, because as this example shows, affect is a matter of how we feel about the feeling of something. As Spinoza says, affect is the idea we form in response to a stimulus, not the response itself. So the response is bodily, but that bodily response gives rise to an idea, and that idea is the affect. We could perhaps explain this variability in affect by saying that every person perceives the world differently, which may well be true, but it would not by itself account for the variability within a single person's responses to stimuli. In order to get to that particular problem, we would need to think about the variability in people's capacity to respond to stimuli. This in turn leads to the conclusion that affect cannot be regarded as purely receptive, but must instead be thought of as active. The implications of these claims will obviously require some unpacking, But I want to preface that discussion by focusing on an issue that receives comparatively little attention at the granular level, if you like, namely, what do Deleuze and Guattari actually mean by desire? Now, as I argued in my book, Assemblage, Theory and Method, we cannot understand the concept of the assemblage in isolation from the concept of desire. And this imperative applies doubly, as it were, to affect, which is effectively the material form of desire. However, we need to move beyond what are now cliche generalities, such that the truism that Deleuze and Guattari reject the idea that desire can be understood as either lack or fantasy. This is, I think, generally well known amongst people who are interested in their work. But by itself, it is practically useless because it doesn't tell us what desire is or how it functions. It only sort of tells us what it isn't. Knowing that desire isn't motivated by what it lacks and its productions are not fantasies is obviously crucial, but as I said, it really only tells us what desire isn't. The same can be said for the claim that desire isn't an undifferentiated energy, which Deleuze and Guattari do make. It is obviously important to know this, but it still only functions as the negative of what desire is. As such, we need to look elsewhere in their work for guidance. But this is by no means straightforward because on the positive side of the ledger, as it were, things are not much better in that the equally well-known fact that for Deleuze and Guattari, desire is productive is not by itself all that useful in that it isn't obvious what they actually mean by this. Evidence of this can be seen in the secondary literature on Deleuze and Guattari, where it has given rise to an anything goes approach that treats all productions of literally every variety as essentially the same, usually without drawing a distinction between what might be considered in Deleuze and Guattari's terms healthy and unhealthy productions. The definition of desire that we need to move beyond the generalities of what desire isn't a way to be found hiding in plain sight in the opening chapter of Anti-Oedipus. And although it prefaces the discussion of desire as being neither about lack nor fantasy and leads into a discussion of desire as a productive force, it has been largely overlooked. Yet it is the foundation of everything else they write about desire. So desire, as Deleuze and Guattari define it, borrowing from and effectively inverting Kant, is the cause of reality of the world as we encounter it. So desire is the cause of reality. This should be understood in two senses. First, in the transcendental empiricist sense that Deleuze outlines in Difference and Repetition, and second, in what might be termed an affective materialist sense. I use this phrase, which I don't necessarily like, but just to make sure that we don't start thinking that I'm talking about vital materialism. Inasmuch that it is our desire that shapes the reality of the world as it is today. So, as I've argued elsewhere, the world is as it is because of desire. This is one implication that we would have to draw from their work. To put it even more strongly, the world is the way it is because we desire it to be this way. But it is never our desire in an individual or personal sense, because all desire is collective, according to Deleuze and Guattari. So it is our collective desire for commodities, rapid transport, electricity, and so on, that has led to the predicament we currently face of a planet becoming increasingly inimical to life as we know it. It also accounts for all the hostilities and inequalities and so on. Thus, we can say, for example, that the desire in me to own a car is a molecular component of the molar desire called automobility and all that entails, roads, petrol stations, car dealers, and so on, which is expressed at a population level. Now, we must be wary here of overemphasizing the desire of individuals, hence my not very satisfactory phrase of the desire in me, as the cause of the current crisis. And so it's not a point that I particularly want to push. So in other words, there is a sense by which we have to try to think about desire as collective, and that the collective then works its magic in the individual. So it is my sense that both assemblage theory and affect theory, but especially affect theory, have kind of created what I would call a Deleuze and Guattari consensus, and thereby they run the risk of imposing a kind of Oedipalization without Oedipus on schizoanalysis by prioritizing individual actions. So the molar in this sense is not simply the aggregate of all the molecular elements of desire, but rather the force of the collected exerted in the individual. So automobility, to continue the above example, pre-existed the invention of the car as a molar form of desire to remake the world in such a way as to foreground speed, and in doing so created the possibility of the molecular form expressed in the desire of individuals to own cars. So affect is present in every one of these material things as their reason for being: speed, convenience, comfort, the distinction of owning a car in Bourdieu's sense, and so on, are all instances of what may be usefully termed materially realized affects. That they are affects and not simply material effects can be discerned in their relativity. There is no absolute, universal, or final form of something like convenience, and it can only be quantified in terms of the more or less, or what Deleuze and Guattari refer to following Husserl as vague and material essences. In other words, essences that are vagabond and exact and yet rigorous, distinguishing them from fixed, metric, and formal essences. So vague essences relate to what Deleuze and Guattari refer to as materiality, which they qualify by saying it should not be confused with thinghood. It is qualitative rather than quantitative materiality that refers to a quality expressed in or by a thing rather than the thing itself. For example, the roundness of a vase rather than the vase. They acknowledge that Husserl conceived vague essences as an intermediary between the essence and the sensible, between the thing and the concept, a little like the Kantian schema, they say, but go on to say that it is only intermediary in the sense of opening up a space of what they call becoming, between things and between thoughts, thus establishing a whole new relation between thoughts and things, a vague identity between the two. Now, this materiality has two characteristics. It is inseparable from processes of transformation, i.e., it is fundamentally variable in itself, and it has expressive qualities which manifest as affects. The distinction between the formal and the vague is exemplified by the difference between the circle, which is formal, fixed, and ideal, and roundness, which is vague and fluid, and importantly, distinct from both the circle and objects which are round. So convenience, to continue the previous example, is not a formal essence, and it cannot be. Today's convenient gadget is tomorrow's outmoded junk. Nor is it a specific property of an object. The fallacy of so-called intuitive design attests to this. It is rather the object's transformative potential that attracts the sobriquet of convenience. This is something that has long been understood and exploited by advertising, which sells the feeling of transformation, the new you, not things and affects rather than properties. Thus, in advertisements, the leather seats in a car are life-changingly luxurious, but also comfortable, durable, masculine or feminine, smart-looking, and so on. They are the reason to purchase this car and not some other, which is like a doubling of alienation. Not only do we not know how the car is made or even operates, we no longer even care about such things. It is the seats that matter, not the fact that the car is capable of taking us from point A to point B. Roland Barthes' great book, Mythologies, could be rewritten in these terms. Everything he designated as a sign could be recoded as an affect. And as he shows, and here the essay on margarine is exemplary, advertising begins by chiding us for resisting the transformative powers of a given commodity, then rewards us for our discovery with access to a new set of affects that had hitherto been withheld. So ultimately, in spite of its expediency, the idea of the desire in me isn't very satisfactory because it presupposes the very thing that must be explained, namely the nature of desire itself, which brings us back to Kant. Now, Deleuze and Guattari reject Kant's argument that the reality of desire causes a merely psychic reality, and instead insists that what desire produces is the real itself. It is not by chance, they say, that Kant chooses to illustrate his claim that desire causes reality with superstitious beliefs, hallucinations, and fantasies, because in his view, we are well aware that the real object can be produced only by an external causality and external mechanisms, but nonetheless act as though we believe in the intrinsic power of desire to create its own object, albeit in an unreal, hallucinatory, or delirious form. As such, they say, Kant's critical revolution changes nothing essential. Now, this was the conclusion Deleuze had already reached in the book he wrote before he met Guattari, namely Difference and Repetition. He says that the much touted break in philosophy, the fabled before and after Kant, essentially amounts to the same thing, i.e., nothing of consequence actually changed. Of more interest, he argues, is the moment when Kant puts rational theology into question, because in that instant, he introduces a kind of disequilibrium, a fissure or crack in the pure self of the I think, an alienation in principle, insurmountable in principle. The subject can henceforth represent its own spontaneity only as that of an other, and in doing so invoke a mysterious coherence in the last instance, which excludes its own, namely that of the world or of God. Now, it doesn't matter that Kant soon resolves this crisis, Deleuze says, because for a brief moment, we enter into that schizophrenia in principle, which characterizes the highest power of thought and opens being directly onto difference. So we can trace, in my view, we can trace the entire development of schizoanalysis to this moment because it positions the schizophrenic experience, which we might provisionally define following Foucault, who was in turn inspired by Borges, as the stark impossibility of thinking that. So the schizophrenic experience then becomes the starting point of how we think about the formation of experience rather than its end point. And from the opening pages of Anti-Oedipus, Deleuze and Guattari constantly foreground a variety of ideas, thoughts, and desires that humans are capable of, from wanting to be a plant or an animal or a machine. And doubtless there is a certain sensationalism in what they do. Michel Foucault identified a similar tendency in Foucault, who he says, and I'm quoting from Foucault here, traps strange things which he discovers in a past literature and uses these for disturbing our fragile present securities. But it also lays bare a central problematic with regards to the operation of desire. For what interested Deleuze in Difference and Repetition, which carried over into his collaborations with Guattari, is precisely the capacity of the mind to produce intensities which not only precede and give shape to thought, but also seem to force us to think in particular ways. Now, affect is not something we feel in response to a given situation, in other words. It is the foundation and limit of what we are able to feel in response to a given situation. Affect produces the feeling. Deleuze writes, something in this world forces us to think. This something is an object not of recognition, but of a fundamental encounter. It may be grasped in a range of affective tones, wonder, love, hatred, suffering, and so on, but in whichever tone, its primary characteristic is that it can only be sensed. This something is not an object of recognition because, as Deleuze explains, in recognition, the sensible bears directly upon the senses in an object which can be recalled, imagined, or conceived. The sensible object presupposes the exercises of the senses, and the exercises of the other faculties in a common sense. By contrast, the object of encounter, this something which forces us to think, gives rise to its own form of sensibility, which Deleuze and Guattari refer to as becoming. And that something which forces us to think is affect. Transcendental empiricism, as Deleuze calls his project Indifference and Repetition, which is the theoretical matrix of schizoanalysis, is the conceptual map of this mode. Empiricism, he says, truly becomes transcendental and aesthetics apodictic only when we apprehend directly in the sensible that which can only be sensed, the very being of the sensible. Difference, potential differences, and difference in intensity is the reason behind qualitative diversity. This realm, which Deleuze does not name, but only designates as the object of his inquiries under the banner of transcendental empiricism, is, I want to suggest, the domain of affect. This domain is conceived by Deleuze as an intense world of differences, which exhibit a strange reason, that of the multiple of chaos and difference of nomadic distributions and crowned anarchies. In Deleuze's view, Kant botches his own discovery, as he and Guattari would later say of Freud, by designating it as a realm of receptivity lacking the power of synthesis. Kant's assumption, according to Deleuze, is that the passive self, which I'm calling the domain of affect, receives sensations that are already formed, which are then related to a priori forms. In this way, he unifies the fractured self that his own thought had put into crisis and rules out the idea that it might be formed step by step and that it might exercise a power of synthesis. By contrast, Deleuze holds that receptivity, so the domain of affect, must be defined in terms of the formation of local selves or egos, in terms of the passive syntheses of contemplation or contraction, thereby accounting simultaneously for the possibility of experiencing sensations, the power of reproducing them, and the value that pleasure assumes as a principle. So it is not receptivity, the capacity to experience sensations, that defines the affective domain of the self, but rather the contemplating and contracting machines underpinning it, which constitute the bedrock of how we experience stimuli. So affect is typically positioned as a response to stimuli, but as Deleuze and Guattari showed, is more usefully thought of as that which determines the kind of response we may have in response to stimuli. So Deleuze exemplifies this claim with reference to Beckett in a passage that will be familiar to anyone who's read Anti-Oedipus. Malloy's series of stones, Murphy's biscuits, Malone's possessions. It is always a question of drawing a small difference, a weak generality, from the repetition of elements or the organization of cases. It is undoubtedly one of the more profound intentions of the new novel to rediscover below the level of active syntheses the domain of passive syntheses which constitute us, the domain of modifications, tropisms, and little peculiarities. Now, these syntheses are not simply micro-perceptions, they are the working parts of our desiring machines, which are the forerunners to the assemblage, which, when they're working, generate and sustain a specific mode of feeling, expressed in terms of attraction and repulsion, which is to say a certain capacity to act. The difference between non-schizophrenics and schizophrenics is that schizophrenics are conscious of and have direct experience of these working parts for themselves. And this is what they mean when they say the schizophrenic experiences nature as a process of production. For most of us, thinking and feeling occurs spontaneously without either conscious effort or awareness. Indeed, we are often mystified by our own thoughts and feelings, which is why the psychotherapy industry in all its myriad forms, from self-help to mindfulness to professional care, is thriving. But all forms of psychotherapy assume that the process of thought is essentially orderly, or at least susceptible to being ordered, i.e., that we can know finally why we think that. But what schizophrenia demonstrates is that this is not necessarily the case. Schizophrenia is profoundly disordering at the level of process. And Deleuze and Guattari build their understanding of this aspect of schizophrenia into their account of desire as a machinic process that works precisely by going off the rails altogether. So desiring machines work only when they break down. And the original French word is détraquer, which would mean literally going off the rails, and by continually breaking down. In this respect, one might treat desiring machines as a pathological form that in their very productivity disrupt the orderly functioning of the mind. Now, if this is the case, and it does seem that way in Anti-Oedipus, then we have another reason why they replace the concept of the assemblage why desiring machines were replaced with the concept of the assemblage, because Deleuze and Guattari wanted to create an affirmative model of desire, one that was capable of staying on the rails as much as going off the rails. So ultimately, Deleuze and Guattari postulate that desire is the set of passive syntheses that engineer partial objects, flows, and bodies, and that function as units of production. The real is the end product, the result of the passive syntheses of desire as the auto-production of the unconscious. And it is on this basis that they proclaim that desire is a machine and that the object desire is another machine connected to it. So if desire is the cause of the reality of the world we encounter, then the set of passive syntheses are the cogs and springs that, like a watch's mechanism, makes that reality real to us without themselves being seen. Affect, as it is construed by affect theory, has neither this power nor this dignity, because it is conceptually positioned as something that operates within an existing reality, rather than as the cause of that reality. Affect theory treats affect as a form of reception, whereas for Deleuze and Guattari, it is an apparatus of production. For affect theory, affect is an attribute of the body, but this, it seems to me, is both a diminishment of Spinoza's argument and a weakening of the concept of affect as it functions in Deleuze and Guattari's work. Now, as I said, I have three theorems which I'm going to just quickly turn to before I wrap up. So the first theorem was that affect is capacitating. And affect as a capacitating power, if you like, is the bedrock of how we relate to the world in our everyday lives. And this theorem is derived from their work on Spinoza, which would take us too far to go into in any great detail. But affect theory tends to treat Spinoza as the only part about Deleuze and Guattari's work that matters. But it's, in my view, this is completely false. So affect theory treats it as self-evidently anchoring affect in the body. But is that really where this question takes us, to the body, or more precisely to an understanding of the body as the ultimate reference point for meaning, as the ultimate form of signifier, and so on? So affective capacities are shown by Deleuze to be powers of the mind. He says, an affect of our body is only a corporeal image, and the idea of the affection as it is in our mind an inadequate idea and imagining. And we have yet another sort of affection. From a given idea of an affection, there necessarily flow affects or feelings, and such feelings are themselves affections, or rather a new kind of affection. So it is our ideas that function as affections, and they indicate to us both the state of our body and any changes our body might have undergone. But they remain firmly artifacts of the mind, not the muscles. These affections are passive in Spinoza's terms because the idea we form of our body in most circumstances is not explained by our power of understanding. For example, the feeling of hunger is something that we suffer rather than cause. As such, it is not the product of our understanding, but merely a passive affection. And in Spinoza's terms, it is an inadequate idea. The sensations in our stomach interpreted by us as the feeling of hunger are not then affects. They only become affects once we form an image of them in our mind and develop ideas in response to that image. And here we might think of an infant who experiences a certain discomfort in their stomach and cries, but does not know, we assume, what causes that discomfort, but ceases to cry when they are offered food. In time, they will close the loop and realize that the discomfort they're experiencing means that they require or desire food, but in their earliest days, it is experienced as discomfort without cause, which is why Spinoza regarded childhood as, I quote, an abject state, because it is characterized by passive affections. Conversely, Deleuze and Guattari described Spinozism as the becoming child of philosophy because of the way it defamiliarizes everything that we think we know, including what a body is and what a body can do. So the central question of Deleuze's account of Spinozism is whether or not it is possible to reach a stage in one's life when it is possible to produce adequate ideas. And this, according to Deleuze, is an ethical question. It is an ethical question because being able to produce adequate ideas means being able to act rather than simply suffer affections. And Hamlet's to be or not to be soliloquy is undoubtedly the most well-known meditation on this problematic. But what he is precisely wrestling with is the problem of how to become active in the face of his sea of troubles that seem to condemn him to passivity. The answer to this problem, as it slowly dawns on him, is to recognize that suffering is itself a power of action insofar as one is able to exercise one's power of understanding on the affections one experiences. And this is doubtless one of the reasons Hamlet remains of such enduring interest to philosophy. Through his seemingly endless equivocations about what has happened and whether he should act, he finds the means of transforming his passivity into activity by power of his understanding of his own situation. As Deleuze put it in a short essay on Kant, Hamlet is the first hero who truly needed time in order to act, whereas earlier heroes were subject to time as the consequence of an original movement or an aberrant action. It is true that passive affections also engage our capacity to be affected, but do so in a way, such a way as to make apparent its limitations. In suffering, we are essentially cut off to a greater or lesser degree from our power to act. And this is the basis of Spinoza's famous claim that we do not know what a body is capable of. So I'm a little bit conscious of time, and I haven't really gone through the other two theorems, so I'll just quickly summarize them and then I'll stop. If affect is the capacity of the power to act, then what I'm also saying is that affect is composed of multiple and potentially divergent ways of thinking and being in the world, which, you know, if you think about your desire to go to work on a Monday morning, it's often narrated to ourselves and to others as a struggle. But if you think about what you're actually struggling, you're struggling between competing forms of desire. And so what I'm suggesting is that we should think of that in a quantum form, that it literally is competing forms of multiple varieties of desire. And then the third theorem is that which version of that desire wins on the day has to do with the way by which those quantum pieces are combined and the kinds of capacitating affects they're able to generate as a consequence. And if you think about a lot of the sort of mood altering drugs that people take both clinically and recreationally, in a sense, what those drugs do is change the combinations, change the kinds of affects that we have by changing the combinations of affects that we have at a quantum level and allowing some aspects of them to become more superpowered than others and put others into abeyance. And so that's sort of where I've been going with this, is to sort of think, well, we have affect as that which capacitates us to do things, but that then would need to be explained by itself, and that can then be understood as in a quantum sense but the quantum by itself does not explain things, because we would still need to think about the various combinations and why one combination of affect works better or works differently from another. Anyway, as you can see, it's an endless topic. So thank you all, and I'd be very happy to take questions.
Great. Ian, thank you so much. That was enormously dense. Hell of a lot to take in, you know, all at once, in a verbal way, I would say. So yes, I have 1,000 questions, so I'm going to let people gather their minds, but I am going to jump in right at the beginning and take advantage of my position as host, and ask you something that's been kind of now, and I hope I didn't miss it in all of the density of the presentation, but two things you said, that desire is the cause of reality. In a sense, it shapes our reality. The way the world is that way because we desire it to be. And then the other, we're forced to think not by recognition, but by an encounter, and that encounter is affect. So my question is very practical, is that if that is true, can we intentionally reshape desire or reshape affect? Can we do things to people to make them feel a different affect from the one that is creating the environmental polycrisis? Can we reshape desire to make people change in some way? It's a very practical question, but can we do it? Or is it something that is not possible as an intentional effort by, I don't know, enviro activists to reshape desire? Because that seems to be what's needed globally.
I mean, it clearly is possible, because capitalism is living proof that it is possible.
There you go. Yes.
People have been persuaded to desire against their interests, to the point where even though we know the planet is burning, we continue to desire the very things that are causing that to happen. So it certainly is possible, and we have that as an ongoing demonstration of that point. Whether or not one can find ways of persuading people to desire differently from that, in recognition that that's a bad way of going, that we should perhaps try to do something different, is far more complicated. Not at the level of the mind, I don't think, but at the level of the sort of Deleuze and Guattari talk about as a sort of stratification, the ways by which some ideas become so deeply entrenched that we barely even know that we're thinking them, and we don't know how to extricate ourselves from them. And also just the nature of the world system itself. Like, I was reading this morning, apparently Google are now preparing themselves to purchase 7 nuclear reactors to power their AI systems. And so if you had an objection to nuclear power, which I think is a not unreasonable position, then how on earth would you say, well, I'm going to stop using Google? Like, you literally couldn't. And if you had an objection to Amazon, and you said, well, I'm not going to have anything to do with Amazon, but then someone said to you, well, at least a third to maybe half of the world's internet traffic goes via an Amazon system, how would you disengage? So we've created a world system that, however much we object to it, we don't know how to disentangle ourselves
from it. Yes, thank you. Yeah. And then a quick follow-up to that, wouldn't it be that the whole capitalist world system that we've created fits in with what we desire, rather than having shaped our desire from something else? That maybe...
yeah, I mean, it's hard for us to sort of think about what would provoke us to the point where we would actually do something differently, because we generally imagine that in terms of loss, like, oh, no Google or no Amazon or no internet, like it's unthinkable. And so it's a way by which desire functions as a form of attachment, And I think that's quite important, that we're deeply attached to these things, and to give them up is inconceivable.
Yeah.
Which is why South Africa is so interesting to me as a country, because you have so many things that, to me, I take for granted, that are constantly sort of dangled at you, like, oh, well, water is not something you can absolutely rely on. Power is not something you can absolutely rely on. So in some ways, it's a profound thought experiment on what does it look like to actually say, well, we're going to do without this thing, and we're going to do it differently because we have to. But that sort of compulsion is not really happening in enough ways, on enough levels, to bring about a sort of global change of heart. But in some ways, South Africa is a demonstration of what it looks like when you take something away and compel people to do things differently.
But we do things differently just to get it back. So we go
Exactly.
anyway, I don't want to dominate the conversation. Glenn, I see your hand is raised. Do you want to come in and chat?
Hi, Andrea, and hi, Ian. This was absolutely fascinating. I'm so glad that I could absolutely join the seminar this morning. And I was so fascinated, Ian, by this idea about the competing quantum desire and the complex soup which will influence what the affect is on a particular day. But then I was also struck by this idea that you posited about why people would turn to mood-altering substances or drugs or psychotropics. And so then it made me think about addiction and the affect which comes out of addiction. So are people addicted then to the affect? Or does affect cause addiction? That's just a thought which came up. So do you mind unpacking that a bit more, your thoughts around your theorems and how affect and addiction are connected somehow?
Yeah, thank you, Glenn. I don't think I would claim to have a theory of that, but I think that the question is important. And one of the reasons why I became interested in affect as a problematic is that it does seem to me that we spend a lot of time culturally and socially managing affect. Like, I think of, fairly benign forms like listening to popular music or watching, crappy TV or whatever. But those are, when we talk about things that are entertaining or distracting and so on, we are really talking about sort of cultural mood management or cultural affect management. And it seems to me that absolutely mood altering substances of whatever variety, whether it's, alcohol or cigarettes or anything stronger than that, clearly plays a part. Now, I wouldn't want to try to answer whether, which comes first, because part of the problem with the sort of stronger forms of psychoactive drugs is that they eventually change the composition of your affect such that, that's what addiction means. You become dependent upon that chemical in order to attain that. And one of the things that Deleuze and Guattari talk about with respect to drugs is that they say explicitly that it's an unsustainable form of affect transformation. And so they then raise the question of, well, is it possible to get drunk on pure water, which is Henry Miller's famous quote. So thinking about affect as something that we manage, but we can't necessarily manage it by power of pure thought. And so therefore we rely on certain kinds of substances. But the problem with that is that it displaces the burden of that mood management onto the substance itself. And so the pure form for them is to say, well, how could we do it by power of thought itself?
Thanks so much. Fascinating.
Okay, thanks, Glenn. I see that there's a question in the chat from Emma, and then Roger has his hand up. So let's see if we can fit in those two. So Emma, do you want to come in and speak to your question?
Hi there. Thanks very much, Ian.
You're very welcome.
Yeah, I really enjoyed your talk. Yeah, so it's more of it's a question slash thought, but it's just sort of a gut reaction. But when you talked about in the beginning assemblage theory, which I'm familiar with through your work actually, predominantly, and its disconnect from affect as being twins separated at birth. I wondered whether or not the way I wrote about it in the chat box is we can consider the connection between these two concepts or theorems, if you like, to be an ontological one, meaning that in terms of assemblage theory, how things assemble and affect, what we have is a situation of openness, because in order to affect and to be affected, there's a sharing, there's a vulnerability, there's an openness. On an ontological level, I'm talking about. So it feels like interrelationality and the dynamism involved in that, because interrelationality is not static, it's motion, suggests that a process ontology, an interrelational process ontology, is what links for me assemblage theory to affect on a level separate to, you talked about the molar and the different molecular levels. So I just wondered if that metaphysical level is relevant at all. Yeah, I'm just trying to understand it a bit more. So perhaps that's another link that could be considered between affect and assemblage, is the ontological one. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely think it is ontological. It's never been clear to me the degree to which Deleuze and Guattari follow. I noticed the other question here from Jaco about Whitehead. It's never been clear to me the degree to which Deleuze and Guattari are, in fact, followers of Whitehead. That's very much Brian Massumi who picks up that and has made it seem as though that's what they do. But there's not a lot of evidence within their work that they ever actually followed Whitehead to any great extent. But I've been thinking about it in slightly different ways, that if you, so I don't know if you have read or have been kind of conscious of the fact that there was the report on the Grenfell Towers disaster of 2017 has just been released. And I've been reading a few accounts of that. And what's quite interesting about that is that on the one hand, you have an account of a sort of systemic failure where they've deregulated, et cetera, and that sort of created the conditions for the disaster. But on the other hand, you have an account of regulations that were not particularly great, but were so maliciously and callously performed that they became a disaster. And so it strikes me that within an assemblage of the system of regulating building authority, whatever, affect is always present there in a way that is hard to capture by assemblage theory by itself, because it's part of the way by which people execute those systems. So this particular report sort of spoke about the way by which the local council were completely contemptuous of the people who lived in Grenfell Towers and basically did nothing to make it safer. Even though they knew that it was unsafe, they did nothing to make it unsafe, and so on. So I want to try to think about ways to build an account of affect into our thinking about regulatory systems, and to see that if the regulatory system is an assemblage, it's an assemblage that nevertheless contains and mobilizes affect as part of what it does.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Em. Roger?
Great, thank you, Ian. Yeah, super thought-provoking. I'm much newer to Deleuze and Guattari, but familiar with some of their work. I was wondering something on this idea of thinking going off the rails, and that's really valuable because that's where novelty and newness is. But that can also be a very difficult destabilizing thing to do, because it's not just sort of a place to stand and then we go somewhere else and, you know, we can feel safe necessarily. So I'm wondering what might need to also be part of that, particularly from an embodied sense, to be able to work more skillfully with that potentially destabilizingness of going off the rails.
Yeah, so in Anti-Oedipus, they talk a lot about a sort of a binary between breaking through and breaking down. That there is, on the one hand, breaking through as a sort of artistic sensibility of I've had a breakthrough and now I'm able to create this new kind of work that I've been trying to achieve. but that always runs the risk of a breakdown, which is to sort of lose the capacity to do any kind of work. And so within that book, there was always this, almost a dialectic between being able to do and then not being able to do. But they fundamentally saw schizophrenia as a going off the rails, as a radical divergence. I think within 1,000 Plateaus, they've tried to modify that and to develop an affirmative form of it, which allows for the idea of a change in the way that one thinks that does not necessarily court disaster. So that, the creative writer or the creative artist or whatever can produce works that are profoundly different without actually leading to a mental breakdown. So, no one's really ever said that Picasso had a mental breakdown, but his work produced a profound change in how people thought about what could be done with art at a particular moment in time. So it was absolutely a breakthrough, but it was apparently a breakthrough that did not court a breakdown. So they wanted to try to think about creativity in a sort of non-pathological way. Initially, though, I think they were trying to rescue the pathological from a certain kind of stigma. And having done that, they realized that they then had to rescue the idea of the non-pathological as well.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there's some interesting implications there for in the polycrisis, dealing with things like eco-anxiety, to not to sort of have the breakthrough of realizing what's happening, but not to not to have that result in a breakdown. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, we have actually just run out of time. And I just want to thank you, Ian, for, as usual, and a very, very dense, rich, productive, exciting talk. Very happy that we have it recorded and that we will put it on YouTube and we can actually go and listen to it again and again. And I really, really hope that this imaginary book that you're talking about will finally get written.
I've written a lot. It's just I keep discarding a lot. So it's progression.
Yes. They say that these great thinkers and all of that, what you actually read is 10% of what they actually produced. Nevertheless, I think this particular topic definitely needs a very practical book to help us in the polycrisis. But
I think this was very dense when I was writing it, so it's been revelatory to me to read it and then suddenly realize, oh my God, I should be unpacking this a lot more. So I do thank you all for being guinea pigs on this particular version.
Well, it was wonderful, and we're happy to be guinea pigs anytime. So thank you everyone for joining. And this is our final seminar for the year on what were we thinking. But we will gather together again next year on a new topic, I'm sure, and I'm sure it will be equally interesting and exciting. Haven't quite thought of what it'll be yet, but I think it was a really fitting end to end on this particular note of thinking about thinking. So thank you very much. And
hopefully I will see you in your town sometime soon.
Yes, we will make that happen. We will talk.
You should come and visit me.
That too. Yeah.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Andrea.
Bye.